two tanks decided the fate of World War II, the Soviet T-34 and the American M4 Sherman. There's no denying that both of these machines fundamentally altered the course of history, but the question remains, which one was actually better? And more importantly, which one contributed the most to the ultimate victory in 1945? Today, we are settling this debate once and for all. Sherman versus T-34. Let's wind the clock back to 1936. The Red Army boasts the largest tank fleet on the planet. But, just like everyone else at the time, they have almost zero real combat experience. Their ranks are mostly filled with light tanks, machines like the T-26 and the BT-5. During their combat debut in the Spanish Civil War, they did all right. But the gasoline-powered T-26 had a fatal flaw. It loved to catch fire. Both models proved tragically vulnerable to the German 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun. Across the Atlantic, up until 1939, the United States was barely building any tanks at all, and the few they did have, let's just say they left a lot to be desired. The US government was sticking to a strict policy of isolationism. They simply didn't think they'd need heavy armor to fight someone else's war. Then came the German Blitzkrieg across Europe, followed by the shock of Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the rules of the game completely changed. Over in the Soviet Union, the Red Army's leadership realized they desperately needed a tank with shell-proof armor. Attempts to modernize their outdated chassis were leading nowhere. Enter Mikhail Koshkin, the brilliant chief designer at the Kharkiv tractor plant. He developed a concept from the ground up that would eventually become the iconic T-34. This new machine was an absolute beast, reliable, rugged, and packed with revolutionary innovations, thick, sloped armor, independent Christie suspension, and the beating heart of the tank, the legendary Kharkiv V2 diesel engine. Finally, the deadly risk of gasoline fires was a thing of the past. Koshkin didn't just design this tank, he fought for it. He faced fierce political pressure from the rival Kirov plant in Leningrad, which was developing the KV-1. To prove the worth of his design directly to Stalin, Koshkin did the unthinkable. He personally drove two T-34 prototypes 1,200 kilometers in brutal winter conditions from Kharkiv to Moscow and back. At the time, a cross-country off-road march of that scale was completely unheard of. Tragically, Koshkin never lived to see his masterpiece dominate the battlefield. During that epic run, he contracted pneumonia and died. Looking back, it's chilling to think whether his death was a grim foreshadowing of the brutal conditions that awaited future T-34 crews. The T-34 officially got the green light in September 1940. But production hit a colossal roadblock, Operation Barbarossa. As Nazi forces pushed east, the USSR's main tank factories were directly in the line of fire. What followed was a logistical miracle. Entire industrial cities were dismantled, transported 1,600 kilometers east, and rebuilt from scratch behind the Ural Mountains. It was an exhausting, brutal process, heavily reliant on forced labor. But once the gears started turning again, T-34s began rolling out by the thousands. A single design and total standardization spawned an endless tsunami of heavy metal rumbling toward the Eastern Front. However, the chaos of Barbarossa had one major side effect. The T-34M, an improved variant meant to fix several glaring flaws in the original tank, was completely scrapped. For the Americans, the production story was completely different, and it perfectly highlights the contrast between the two powers. The USSR was a totalitarian state. Stalin and his inner circle ruled the military-industrial complex with an iron fist. If they decided they needed to build a whole new city overnight, Dubbed Tankograd, it got done. The US operated differently. The Army Ordnance Department drafted the blueprints for the Sherman, which were refined at the Rock Island Arsenal. But when those blueprints landed in the laps of corporate giants like Chrysler, Ford, and major railway companies, they wanted to do things their own way. And honestly, from a business standpoint, it made sense. The Sherman's original engine was designed by Wright Aeronautical, but a behemoth like Chrysler wasn't about to spend millions retooling its factories to build someone else's engine when they could just build their own, which led to the creation of this absolute monster, the Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine. It looks like an engineer's fever dream. 5 massive car engines bolted together around a single crankshaft. Soon, multiple corporations were churning out their own variations of the Sherman. Basic assembly methods entirely depended on which factory you were standing in. You had Shermans with welded, cast, and composite hulls, mixed and matched with 4 completely different types of engines. Did this hurt the war effort? Not at all. Each factory was in a race to optimize production, ensuring the supply chain ran like an unstoppable machine, and spare parts were always available. Meanwhile, in the USSR, every T-34 was practically a carbon copy of the last one. The only major exception was the turret. Depending on the factory, you could find cast, welded, or stamped turrets. Throughout the war, they evolved from an early, cramped 2-man turret with 1 massive hatch to the iconic Mickey Mouse twin hatches, and finally to the late-war 3-man turret with a proper commander's cupola. Take this early production T-34-76. Captured by the Finns in 1941, it perfectly represents the exact machine the Wehrmacht slammed into during Operation Barbarossa. And let's be real, for 1941, this was exceptionally lethal hardware. It gave the invading Germans a terrifying reality check. As the famous German general Friedrich von Mellenthin put it, "It was better than anything we had." The T-34 was built for pure mobility. This was critical for the Red Army's core strategy, deep battle. The doctrine relied on rapid, deep penetration encirclements, and for that, the T-34 was flawless. Its heart was the highly efficient Kharkiv V2 diesel. And this wasn't some primitive tech, an aluminum block, dual overhead cams. Fundamentally, its architecture isn't that far off from modern high-performance diesels. Sure, build quality wildly fluctuated from batch to batch, and early models suffered from catastrophic gearbox failures. But overall, the T-34 was famous for its simplicity, reliability, and idiot-proof field maintenance. Its mechanics were often described as tractor-like. But its biggest advantage on the battlefield was the Christie suspension. Massive road wheels and heavy-duty springs allowed the T-34 to fly over horrific off-road terrain at incredible speeds. Combine that with wide, aggressive steel tracks, no rubber pads here, and you get an absolute off-road monster. After all, who needs roads when the Soviet Union barely had any asphalt? Back to the Sherman. 4 different engines across various models, but all of them strikingly reliable. A tank that starts on the first try on a freezing morning is a rare luxury in war. However, the Sherman's original vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, couldn't hold a candle to the T-34's cross-country speed. The issue was the tracks, narrow and fitted with rubber pads. Great for preserving French cobblestone streets, but an absolute nightmare in the mud. Looking at the frozen hellscape of the Eastern Front, it's hard to imagine those early Shermans closing the trap on Paulus's 6th Army at Stalingrad. The Americans recognized this flaw. By 1944, they rolled out the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS. Paired with wider tracks, the Sherman's ground pressure suddenly dropped even lower than the T-34's, a colossal upgrade. The T-34's next major triumph was sloped armor. It wasn't the first to use the concept, but it was the first to apply it in mass production. Sloped armor doesn't just increase the chance of a ricochet, it artificially thickens the steel. Angle a 45mm plate at 60 degrees, and now an armor-piercing shell has to punch through the equivalent of 75mm of solid steel. Were there downsides to the T-34? Oh, absolutely. The fighting compartment turned into a claustrophobic nightmare. On top of that, the decision to place the driver's hatch dead center on the upper glacis defies all logic. They might as well have painted a neon bullseye on the tank's forehead. But even with that, the T-34's armor was so effective that it directly inspired the creation of the German Panther. Sherman hulls, on the other hand, heavily depended on the manufacturer. Cast hulls were 10 to 15% thicker, and their smooth, rounded design was excellent at deflecting shells. But cast steel had inconsistent hardness, was incredibly difficult to repair in the field, and not every factory had the capability to cast it. Welded armor solved those problems. It was uniformly strong, easier to patch up, and much simpler to mass produce. But the Sherman's real Achilles heel was its profile. The tank was incredibly tall. Why? Because that massive radial engine meant the drive shaft had to run directly under the turret basket. The frontal armor was solid, 51mm angled at 56 degrees, giving it about 90mm of effective thickness. But the sides? Dead vertical and only 38mm thick. Worse still, the ammo was stored right behind that thin side armor. Shermans didn't brew up because of their fuel. The culprit was the propellant in the shells. This birthed the grim frontline myth that the Sherman was a highly flammable death trap. The issue was finally resolved in 1944 with the introduction of wet stowage. The ammo bins were surrounded by water and glycol jackets. Brilliant engineering, but it was only factory installed. Most World War II Shermans fought without it. Surviving a hit is one thing, making it out alive is another entirely. Early Shermans had terrifyingly small hatches, just 21 by 16 inches. The loader didn't even have his own roof hatch. In a fire, he had to squeeze under the massive gun breech and follow the commander out. Bailing out turned into a deadly bottleneck. By 1943, they added a loader's hatch. But the real breakthrough came when engineers reduced the frontal armor angle to 47 degrees. This freed up space to install massive, spring-loaded 24 by 19-inch hatches. Escaping a burning Sherman became infinitely easier. And that's the essence of the Sherman, relentless, crew-focused innovation. In stark contrast, trying to escape a burning T-34 was a living nightmare. There was no turret basket, so the crew literally had to climb over each other. The bow machine gunner didn't even have his own hatch. But this was a totalitarian regime. Nobody was collecting feedback from T-34 crews. Ergonomics was simply ignored. And finally, the gun. Early T-34s were armed with the 76mm F-34 gun. In the early years of the war, it was lethal, chewing through early Panzer IIIs and IVs. But once the Tigers and Panthers rolled out, the 76mm was hopelessly outclassed. Here, the stubbornness of the Soviet system cost lives. Stalin forbade any factory retooling that would drop production quotas. It took the staggering losses at the Battle of Kursk in 1943 to finally force him to change his mind. By early 1944, a massive 85mm gun was crammed into the new T-34-85. It could punch through 95mm of armor, but it took a mountain of burnt-out tanks and thousands of dead tankers to make that happen. The Sherman's path was similar. It started with the 75mm M3 gun, an excellent high-explosive thrower, but lacking in armor penetration by 1944. So they swapped it for the 76mm M1, capable of punching through 92mm of steel. Where the Sherman absolutely dominated, though, was in fire control. The M70 sight featured crystal-clear optics. The main gun had a gyroscopic stabilizer, and most importantly, a 5-man crew. The commander, gunner, and loader each did only their specific job. Unlike the Sherman, the T-34-76 had crude, cloudy optics and a cramped four-man crew, where the commander was desperately trying to aim the gun as well. Without a turret basket, the crew had to dance inside as the turret rotated, and ammo storage was a joke. Shells were just lying in wooden crates under rubber floor mats. The result? The Sherman found its target faster, fired faster, and was more accurate at long ranges. The T-34-85 fixed some of this by adding a fifth crew member, but the internal layout remained chaotic. Now, let's talk statistics. 56,000 T-34s were produced, 45,000 were destroyed. Let that sink in. That is an agonizing 80% loss rate. Compare that to the Sherman, just under 50,000 built, around 18,000 to 19,000 lost in combat, plus another 3,000 to 4,000 to mechanical failures. That's a loss rate of roughly 40 to 45%, half that of the Soviet machine. So what's the reason? The tank or the tactics? A huge part of the answer lies in scale. The Wehrmacht threw 140 divisions into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. On the Western theater, only about 50. The Soviet doctrine of deep battle lacked finesse. The core idea was to crash a tidal wave of armor and infantry against the enemy until the front collapsed. Losses were just calculated expenses on the road to total annihilation of the enemy. The Western Allies fought differently. Armor was a precision scalpel for breakthroughs, followed closely by artillery and air support to grind the enemy down, keeping casualties to an absolute minimum. The horrifying casualty rate of the T-34 is a reflection of Soviet ideology and strategy, not just the technology of the tank itself. The T-34 was the ultimate workhorse of the Eastern Front. It drowned the German war machine in an ocean of steel, despite unimaginable losses. The original design was a masterpiece, even if it suffered from flaws that a totalitarian system never bothered to fix. The Sherman started as a capable medium tank and evolved into an absolute logistical triumph, forming the backbone of Western operations across every front. And while these two legends would eventually clash head-to-head in Korea, where the Sherman would prove its superiority, that is a story for another video. So, which tank actually won World War II? There is no doubt that the T-34, especially in the brutal early years, was the revolutionary machine that kept the Soviet Union from collapsing. But if you asked me which tank I'd rather go into battle in, put me in a Sherman every single time. It was vastly superior in build quality, reliability, and above all, survivability. It was backed by an industry that actually valued the lives of its crews. Would the war have ended faster if the Red Army had driven Shermans? Hard to say. Would tens of thousands of Russian tankers have avoided agonizing deaths? Almost certainly. Would Stalin have cared? Absolutely not. In the end, the T-34 contributed more to the destruction of Nazi Germany simply because it was deployed in such massive numbers, in a horrifying slaughter the world had never seen before, and hopefully will never see again. But what's your verdict? Sherman or T-34? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I'll see you on the next video.